Right, so I haven't watched the news today. I don't know what the developments in London are. Been any trouble or not? I'm going to catch the news when I can. But I want to talk about a particular issue that's been on a debate thread that I've been on today. And I should say I'm only going to scratch the surface with this. I don't intend a long, in-depth analysis of the issues, because that really would require a thesis or a synopsis or something like that. I just want to just touch on some of the basic points. And it's this, it's about the legacies of the British Empire and reparations, but a particular issue that came up on the thread, which was the Bengal famine of 1943. Now, this was in the context of the Churchill statue being targeted in London. Of course, that statue has been covered by a metal girder. It was scrawled with "Was a racist" below. Um, Let me just say from the outset, I don't think any historic figure is above criticism, and that includes Churchill. Um, it is true that he is a revered figure in this country, but um, we Britons should be honest that he had a darker side. He did have um, not just politically incorrect views, let's face it, he had racist views. He did. He expressed certain racist sentiments about non-white people throughout his parliamentary life. On other occasions, he took very anti-racist positions. But Churchill was a controversial figure. There's no question about it. But what drove me into thinking about this particular video? An Indian lady who I'd recently befriended, and I may reverse that decision because I'd misjudged her. Thought she was more open-minded than she has recently shown, because she'd actually been very upfront about Indian extremism and Hindu extremism and Muslim extremism, and I just took her to be more open-minded. But recently, her posts on this particular forum have been very basically just Britain bashing. It's just about every single post is usually Guardianista type articles about how evil the British Empire was. And she cited the Bengal famine. But here's the thing: the Bengal famine was a devastating famine. It killed between 3 and 4 million people in 1943. Now, without question, British colonial policies definitely played a role in exacerbating the death toll. There was displacement of people, there was reallocation of resources to troops. This was the midst of World War II. So there's no question about it. British colonial policies played a role in exacerbating the death toll of the Bengal famine. But I really take issue with the charge of genocide, and this is why. A genocide has a very specific meaning. Genocide, which I understand comes from Greek, means a deliberate attempt to wipe out an entire people. So we think the killing fields of Cambodia, we think, of course, the Holocaust, we think Rwanda. They were all deliberate attempts to kill off entire peoples, and there's other examples. Um, what happened in Bengal in 1943 was horrible. Men, women, and children starved to death. That's always horrible. And I can understand Indians feeling very raw about that because it's still within living memory. Um, but genocide, that's a very contentious claim. Now, on the wider subject of reparations, this probably requires a video in of itself, but here's the problem with demanding colonial reparations. The same person claimed that the British should pay 45 trillion in reparations to countries it colonized. Well, leaving aside the fact that Britain is gives away millions every year in foreign aid, and India is a major recipient of that, this starts to get murky when you ask, well, how exactly does this get allocated? For example, if we're giving reparation money to India, should that be distributed proportionally state by state, given that some states have a bigger population than others? Then you're going to have internal debates within. Let's say if Uttar Pradesh gets more than Kashmir, there's going to be a lot of internal schisms there. And what about breakaway states within India, like Nagaland? What's their position going to be? Are they allocated as Indian states or as breakaway states from post-independence India? And if you charge that the British Empire should repay everything, should the same logic be applied to every empire? I mean, the legacy of the Mongol conquests, although it was 800 years ago, can actually still be seen in Western China, where the cultures that flourished there prior to the Mongol conquests never recovered. Um, we're talking about the Central Asian republics. So should the modern Republic of Mongolia pay out reparations to the descendants of the victims of Mongol conquests? As an example, the conquest of Khwarezmia, which is sort of modern day Iran and Uzbekistan, in, well, exactly 800 years ago, roughly between the years 1229 and 1231, may have killed up to 1 million people. It was an absolute bloodbath. Um, so should the modern state of Mongolia pay out reparations to the descendants of those people? Now, you might say, oh, but the Bengal famine and the crimes of the British Empire are much closer in history, and that's true. But then there's other colonial empires, all other European empires, the Portuguese, the French, Spanish. Um, the problem with demanding reparations for imperial records is you, who gets to determine the amount? You know, who gets to say, well, we'll work out exactly. I think it would be pretty much impossible to know where to even begin. I think that the obligation is to recognize our past. And I do think there is a moral argument for paying reparations to living survivors. So, for example, I would say the survivors of the Mau Mau in Kenya, I would say at this point we probably should pay them. I wouldn't have an issue with that. Yes, it's true the Mau Mau engaged in the murder of civilians, but our record there wasn't great. We did engage in torture. Um, we can't say our record was glowing in Kenya or anywhere where we colonized. It wasn't. And, I would take issue with those Britons who are in denial about this. There are some who will always find an excuse for our colonial wrongs. We done terrible things, there's no question about it. But I would argue the amount that we give in foreign aid is a sort of reparation in of itself. And we give millions every year. And we have been giving millions every year for years. I don't know how much that adds up to, but it would be an extensive amount. Um, and here's the thing, particularly with India, this is a country that has its own space program. So I think there's legitimate questions as to how the Indian government is allocating its finances. India still has crippling poverty, yet it has its own space program. So Indian nationalistic pride apparently is more important than dealing with extreme poverty there. Um, I think there's a legitimate contention with that. In other words, Indian nationalists demand reparations from the British, but they'll wave the flag when India is launching its shuttles and so on. In other words, India is a powerful state. It's not some weak little subservient country that's needs to beg money from the British. It's an independent, powerful country. So I just don't buy this notion of victimhood today. Um, I think we should recognize the past, but reparations is a very, very murky area. Um, I think for crimes against humanity, for example, for specific massacres and so on, I do think we should probably pay reparations to direct descendants or direct survivors. I think we should cut a line with, when it gets a certain point beyond living memory. Um, but people who are directly involved, we might have a case of paying out reparations. Um, but where do you draw the line? For example, do you say that the people of Bristol should pay reparations for the slaves held by Edward Colston. That's ridiculous. Because remember, it's the public that would be footing the bill on this, ostensibly. So I just think it gets into a very murky area. That's not the same as saying I think we should hide from our past or not admit our past, but where's the consistency? It just seems to me it is far too convenient to just bash the British, bash Europeans in general, when the same logic isn't applied to other colonial powers. I mean, looking at the history of India, the British weren't the first empire in India. The Muslim conquests in India were absolutely drenched in blood. Um, so where's the demand for reparation from Muslim lands or their successor states? Possibly millions died in the Muslim conquest of India long before the Raj. So it seems to me that there is inconsistency there. And if you actually look at Britain's record in India, there were some high-profile massacres, such as Amritsar, and massacres committed during the Indian Mutiny of 1857, or Indian War of Independence, if you want to call it that. I think that's contentious because India wasn't a unified state prior to those events. But anyway, there were massacres in that time. We done some sadistic things. We done evil things. I mean, we tied rebels to cannons. That was barbaric. I fully acknowledge that. Um, but where where do you draw the line with this? I mean, I think with India, given the time that we colonized India, given I mean the length of time, and given the extent of it, the massacres don't compare to, for example, those committed by the Belgian Congo or other colonial powers in history. Um, I'm not saying they didn't happen, they did, but put it this way, if the British colonial administrators were just massacring people all the time, the they would have been kicked out of India long before. That's the reality. So when it comes to empire, I think we're saying, yes, there might be some who overly glorify it, but there are definitely others on the political left, and some nationalists and countries that were colonized who want to just present it as all negative and all evil and all terrible. My message to those people was if your position is the British Empire was all bad, then you need to accept that the whole legacy was bad, and therefore you need to stop speaking in English. This doesn't seem unreasonable because the English language is one of the legacies of empire, right? So if they really believe all legacies are negative, that includes the English language. So stop speaking in English. I don't think that's hyperbole or unreasonable.